Time, 2:15 a.m. Peak of the Cold War. Location, the East River, New York City. The city is fast asleep, but on the black water. Suddenly, heavy searchlights pierce the darkness. It carries nuclear-capable strike aircraft and enough firepower to level a small nation. But to conquer the global oceans, this multi-billion-dollar Leviathan first has to survive a trial right in its own backyard. Blocking its path is not an enemy blockade or a swarm of cruise missiles. It is a 19th century highway of stone and steel, the iconic Brooklyn Bridge. From the bridge's pedestrian walkway, the incoming warship looks impossibly massive. It looks like a guaranteed collision that could tear the bridge apart and plunge New York City into chaos. 500 yards. 300 yards. 100 yards.
Lower the mast! Flood the ballast tanks!
What happened next remains one of the most incredible, top-secret engineering compromises in military history. The world's most dominant navy had to physically bow to a civilian bridge. But why? Why couldn't the most powerful government on Earth just alter the bridge or move their ships elsewhere? To understand this clash of titans, we have to look into the secret heart of American naval power. The real anchor of this story is a legendary piece of waterfront property, the Brooklyn Navy Yard, officially known as the New York Naval Shipyard. Established in 1801, when the United States was still a young and fragile republic, the federal government chose this location on the East River because it was highly strategic. Surrounded by dense urban land, the yard remained protected from enemy fleets and submarines, making it one of America's safest naval construction sites. By World War II, the Brooklyn Navy Yard had become the beating heart of America's military-industrial complex.
At its peak, the shipyard operated 24 hours a day, employing more than 70,000 shipwrights, engineers, and mechanics. It earned the nickname the Can-Do Yard.
This single shipyard gave birth to some of the deadliest warships in history, including the legendary USS Missouri, the battleship where World War II officially came to an end. But despite its incredible success, the Brooklyn Navy Yard carried one geographic curse. It wasn't built on the open ocean. Every warship constructed here had to travel through the narrow East River before reaching the Atlantic. And standing directly along that route was a magnificent structure completed in 1883. A bridge that would quietly control the future of America's largest warships for decades to come. When Chief Engineer John A. Roebling designed the Brooklyn Bridge in the 1870s, it was considered the eighth wonder of the world, the longest suspension bridge ever attempted. To ensure commercial ships could still use the river, engineers set the bridge's vertical clearance, known as the air draft, at 127 feet during high tide. At dead low tide, that clearance increased to approximately 133 feet, providing what engineers believed was more than enough space for future ships. For the year 1883, this was considered an incredibly generous design. The oceans were still ruled by tall wooden sailing ships. If a wooden mast proved too tall, it could simply be lowered or temporarily dismantled before continuing the journey. More importantly, radar had not yet been invented. Engineers in 1883 had no way of imagining the electronic warships that future naval vessels would carry enormous steel radar masts and radio antennas that could never be chopped down with an axe like a wooden mast. When the Brooklyn Bridge officially opened on May 24th, 1883, it became a triumph of American engineering. But without anyone realizing it, the bridge also placed an invisible ceiling above the future of the United States Navy. Decades later, that invisible ceiling would force America's most powerful warships into one of the greatest engineering compromises in naval history.
As the mid-20th century approached, naval warfare evolved. Naval supremacy was no longer just about heavy armor, it was about electronic vision. With the advent of radar during World War II and the Cold War, the rule was simple. The higher you place your radar mast, the farther over the horizon you can detect incoming enemy aircraft and missiles.
Consequently, the superstructure of American warships kept climbing higher and higher, stretching to 145 feet, and eventually exceeding 150 feet. The Navy's newest ships were becoming taller than anyone in 1883 could ever have imagined. When the Navy began building the colossal Iowa-class battleships and later the massive Forrestal-class supercarriers at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, planners suddenly hit a wall. The blueprints revealed an alarming truth. These enormous warships were simply too tall to leave the shipyard through the East River. With World War II raging and the fleet desperately needed in the Pacific, delaying construction was not an option. A collision would destroy a priceless military asset and sever one of New York City's most important transportation links. Neither option was acceptable. The Navy needed a solution that could protect both the bridge and the warships. To solve the crisis without tearing down the Brooklyn Bridge or abandoning the legendary shipyard, naval engineers developed three ingenious tactical workarounds. The first solution was simple in theory. If you can't raise the bridge, you must shorten the ship. Engineers redesigned the massive steel radar masts. This was for carriers like the USS Constellation. Heavy-duty industrial hinges were used. Hydraulic counterweight systems were installed at the base. Out at sea, the masts stood perfectly vertical, scanning the skies for enemy aircraft and missiles. But as the ship approached the Brooklyn Bridge, the crew activated hydraulic systems that folded the upper section of the mast downward. Nearly 20 to 30 feet of solid steel folded flat at a 90-degree angle, allowing the carrier to slide beneath the bridge. The second solution relied not on machinery, but on mathematics. Navigators carefully studied lunar cycles and tidal charts to determine the exact moment of dead low tide. By waiting until the river reached its absolute lowest level, they gained an additional 6 to 7 feet of precious overhead clearance. But even folding the mast and waiting for low tide still wasn't always enough. The Navy needed one final solution. By waiting until the river reached its absolute lowest level, they gained an additional 6 to 7 feet of precious overhead clearance. But even folding the mast and waiting for low tide still wasn't always enough. The Navy needed one final solution. This was the most nerve-wracking tactic. To get supercarriers through, the captain would flood the tanks.
Flood the ballast tanks!
The immense weight forced the entire 60,000-ton warship to sink several feet lower into the river. This lowered the ship's top profile, but it created a terrifying secondary danger. The ship's keel was now skimming only a few feet above the muddy, rocky riverbed. One wrong calculation meant running a frontline naval asset aground in front of millions of New Yorkers. Several legendary American warships had to perform this high-stakes dance. USS Missouri, armed with 9 massive 16-inch guns, capable of firing 2-pound shells more than 20 miles, faced this challenge. Before heading into the Pacific, the battleship had to carefully reduce its height and navigate beneath the Brooklyn Bridge without making contact. Another giant was the USS Constellation CV-64, a floating fortress over 1,000 feet long, carrying nearly 5,000. When USS Constellation passed beneath the Brooklyn Bridge, the distance was reported to be less than 6 feet. By the mid-1960s, technology took another giant leap. The U.S. Navy began building nuclear-powered supercarriers like the Nimitz class. These new ships featured massive, non-removable phased-array radars that were far too heavy and structurally integrated to ever be folded on a hinge. Their permanent height extended well beyond 160 feet. No amount of folding or ballast could ever bring them beneath the Brooklyn Bridge. No amount of flooding ballast tanks could solve the problem. Waiting for low tide could not solve it anymore. The Pentagon faced one final decision: destroy the historic Brooklyn Bridge or close the legendary Brooklyn Navy Yard forever. The bridge was an untouchable cultural icon of New York. The decision was finally made. In 1966, the United States Navy officially decommissioned the Brooklyn Navy Yard as a military base. The bridge had won the standoff. The Navy moved its supercarrier operations to deep-water ports, like Naval Station Norfolk, where no bridge would ever limit the future of America's fleet again.